Hi, this is our presentation on Caroline Duffy.
Caroline Duffy is a famous British poet who is known for her work concerning gender and female oppression. Today we will be discussing how she re-envisions women in her mythological and fairy tale poems, namely Medusa, Delilah, Salome, and Mrs. Beast.
One of the ways that Duffy represents women in her poems is by portraying them as independent, a contrast to how women are usually perceived. In her poems Mrs. Beast and Salome, the female characters are conveyed as sexually, financially, and emotionally independent. Duffy empowers the female characters through their lack of need of men. For example, in her poem Mrs. Beast, Duffy writes, "My own gold stashed in a bank." The possessive noun my and the adjective own acknowledge that the narrator is financially stable when coming to the house of the beast. This presents an alternate standard to traditional fairy tales where young girls are submissive to men. Instead, the narrator Mrs. Beast has her own resources and wealth before independently deciding to ride to the beast's house. Her financial stability is emphasized when she goes on to write My Own Black Horse, adding further contrast to the alternate standard of fairy tales where traditionally the men would leave via horseback and leave the woman at the home alone. Whereas in Duffy's poem, Mrs. Beast has her own horse to carry me off at the wrong word. Mrs. Beast asserts her dominance when repeating the technique, one wrong word, one false move, one dirty look, the repetition of which reinforces her dominance as the threatening tone connotes her ability to leave the beast if not properly respected. Duffy goes on to suggest of Salome's emotional independence in the poem Salome. In this poem, the narrator Salome has woken up with the severed head of John the Baptist. Duffy writes, "I knew I'd feel better for tea, dry toast, no butter." The diction suggests that Salome can recover from her night on the batter, and murder with a regular breakfast conveying her insensitive and dismissive personality. The use of the adjective dry implies a blandness and lack of flavor needed to distract her from last night's actions, all of which portray her emotionless attitude that goes unaffected by the severed head. When Salome rang for the maid, she indicates her authority and high status. This relates back to her independence and Duffy's portrayal of financial independence in women. Duffy goes on to write, "Just what I needed." This shows Salome taking charge over her own recovery from her hungover and wrecked state. This supports Duffy's point on emotional independence as it further implies that Salome relies on herself to feel better and recover. Duffy also presents female characters' sexual independence. When she writes to turf out the blighter, Salome uses the adjective blighter to describe her sexual partners. The demeaning description suggests her lack of empathy or romantic feelings towards them. The descriptive use of erotic language is continued when Salome says, "the beater or the biter, who'd come like a lamb to the slaughter of Salome's bed." The descriptive use of the noun lamb that Salome uses to dehumanize men and show how she views them as prey, small, weak, and innocent, and the diction to the slaughter suggests her satanic and demonic-like activities. Throughout the stanza, Salome dehumanizes men and reduces them to sexual objects for her pleasure and sexual satisfaction, all the while showing that she relies on herself to acquire a string of sexual flings instead of solely relying on one man to please her, once again opposing the traditional stories where it is a group of women used to please the male. Duffy further emphasizes female characters' sexual independence in her poem Mrs. Beast. The narrator says, "The lady says do this, harder. The lady says do that, faster. The lady says that's not what I meant." This quote shows the female dominance and authority. The beginning of every command is capitalized to emphasize the order. The repetition of "the lady says" shows that it's the woman who dictates the beast's actions, taming and using him for her own sexual pleasure. The noun lady is used ironically as typically this wouldn't be ladylike acts. Mrs. Beast addresses this to girls, presenting it as a prideful confession amongst her friends, and displaying how Mrs. Beast has no shame in her reencountment. The woman's dominance in sexual acts further displays female independence as both Mrs. Beast and Salome dictate and control their own sexual experiences, which contrasts the traditional stories where the opposite occurs. In conclusion, Duffy uses both Mrs. Beast and Salome as strong and independent characters in control of their own emotions, wealth, and romances. This contrasts many of the original fairy tales and myths that originally depict submissive and obedient women.
Duffy also represents women by reversing gender roles in her poems Delilah and Salome. Delilah and Salome are female biblical characters originally portrayed as villainous and manipulative. However, Duffy subverts the original text to convey the usurpation of men's authority over women. In Delilah, Duffy writes, "Teach me," he said. The diction of the word teach suggests that Delilah is more knowledgeable than her very masculine partner Samson and hence has power over him. Traditionally, the men are the ones teaching the women. However, in Delilah, Samson relinquishes his authority. In this quote, Duffy explores their intimate relationship as one that is loving and not purely based on deception, as the Bible writes it to be. She also shows Samson's desire to care, a conventionally female trait that Samson is now willing to sacrifice his masculine super strength for. In the second quote, Duffy writes that Samson lay with his head on Delilah's lap. This places Samson in a vulnerable spot, showing that he trusts Delilah and is calm around her. Visually, Samson is at a lower position, implicitly suggesting female superiority and authority. Duffy then demonstrates Samson's transition from strong to weak by characterizing his voice as a soft burr. Throughout the poem, the constant use of words that rhyme with hair refer to the biblical story of Samson and Delilah. In the story, Samson's hair symbolizes his strength, and cutting it would result in having it taken away from him. There is some ambiguity as to why Duffy uses this rhyme scheme, but here's one way to interpret it. The suspense created suggests that Delilah would inevitably betray Samson and destroy his source of strength eventually. Previously, women were portrayed as subject to fulfilling men's desires. However, in her poem Delilah, Duffy reverses gender roles by portraying Samson as wanting to be less authoritative and knowing, and imploring Delilah to help him. In contrast, Duffy writes Salome, a poem that portrays a contemporary woman as independent from men. The female narrator, presumably Salome, objectifies men by describing superficial traits: good looking, dark hair, and reddish beard. She says that a head, alluding to the murder of John the Baptist, so a severed head, lay beside her, but whose? Through the use of synecdoche, Duffy shows how Salome perceives her partner for the night as insignificant, not even bothering to remember his name or his identity. Therefore, she unapologetically sees him as a mere object in a fleeting casual relationship. Later in the poem, she says she needed to clean up her act. This declarative statement demonstrates that, contrary to female stereotypes, Salome is in control of her life and the choices she makes. As a result, a synthetic list of vices follows: booze, meaning alcohol, fags, meaning cigarettes, and sex, as if to show off or brag about her deliberate wanton life as men do. The varying structure of the poem conveys how thoughts pop in and out of Salome's mind, building up the dark theme. As compared to Of Mice and Men, wherein Curly's wife is objectified and unnamed, the poem Salome depicts a reversal of gender roles, betraying societal conventions. Another central theme highlighted in Duffy's poems is the suffering of women, both physically and mentally, emphasized in the poems Medusa and Mrs. Beast. In Greek mythology, Medusa is a popular figure. However, not many know her story. Medusa was seduced by Poseidon and then raped, and when she looked to Athena for protection, she was punished instead and cursed with a head of snakes. The poem is written mainly as sestets, which escalate as Medusa turns a pebble, a bird, and then her husband into stone. This reflects her growing resentment. Duffy's poem Medusa is written from the first person point of view, the Gorgon herself, and she begins the poem by stating, "A suspicion, a doubt, a jealousy." Already the poem has an initial tone of insecurity, suggesting that Medusa is consumed by her problems, mentally draining her. Then, using anaphora, she shows how this anxiety resonates throughout the poem. Directly addressing him, she doubts her lover's loyalty to her, as he would betray her and stray from home, as all men do, a judgment on men. The word home indicates a known world, and as her lover departs, she is no longer able to communicate with him, which develops mistrust within her. Furthermore, she says, "Your girls, your girls." The repetition emphasizes her partner's unfaithfulness, portraying Medusa as corrupted by her feelings of bitterness resulting from the infidelity of her lover, subsequently leading to her personal tragic destruction. Through portraying Medusa's pitiful state as a result of the wrongdoing of man, Duffy subverts the myth, illustrating how anger and jealousy corrupted her life. In Mrs. Beast, Duffy subverts the fairy tale Beauty and the Beast. Using a satirical tone, the female narrator challenges stereotypes by depicting a casual sexual relationship with a beast where she is more dominant and in control. In this poem, Duffy lists many intertextual references of women who suffered and could not win over their situation, shifting her usual theme of female empowerment and strength to sadness and abuse. She mentions Bluebeard's and Henry VIII's wives, most, if not all, of whom had been beheaded and physically abused. A modern day reference to Diana, Princess of Wales, is also made as she was unable to cope with the stress of royal life, not to mention the fact that her husband, Prince Charles, was cheating on her. The poem ends with the narrator desiring to take the man's role. Let the less loving one be me. By writing in free verse, Duffy gives the narrator a more conversational tone and hence allows room to venture beyond her limits, in this case, having a casual relationship out of wedlock. She expresses her wish to carve her own destiny free from the influence of a patriarchy, serving as opposition to subservient female stereotypes.
Duffy also rewrites women by showing the development in women through the maturity they present. She uses this in her poems Medusa and Delilah in order to contrast the original stories of deceitful and immature girls, conveying the development from girls to women. In Duffy's poem Delilah, she rewrites her character as a more loving partner to Samson. In this poem she writes, "And before I fetched and sharpened my scissors, snipping first at the biblical black air, I fastened the chain to the door." While in the original story Delilah betrays Samson for money from his enemies, here she uses the noun chain and refers to her actions on how she locks the door to keep him safe while she cuts his hair, the source of his powers. Duffy shows Delilah's growth from her character in the traditional story, as initially Delilah would betray Samson for her own benefit, whereas now her representation in Duffy's poem show her refusing money and protecting Samson instead, reflecting her maturity. In Duffy's poem Medusa, she explores Medusa's abilities and power, expressing the capabilities of women. When Duffy writes, "I glanced at a buzzing bee," and "I glanced at a singing bird," she goes on to say that she looked at a cat and a pig, turning all of them to stone. The animals slowly increase in size as Medusa grows more confident with her powers. The verb glanced conveys that at first Medusa is hesitant to use her ability, but slowly finds comfort and assurance when she uses it, finding she can use it at ease. Duffy also writes, "I stared at a dragon." Originally she referred to herself as a monster and a gorgon. Now she describes herself as a dragon, powerful and fearful creatures that she uses to reflect herself, portraying herself as a powerful and respected being instead of a monster. In the original stories, Medusa and Delilah were both women and were depicted as foul and treacherous, corrupted by money or men. However, Duffy rewrites their characters into independent and capable women, providing a variety of strong female characters to represent women in modern society.
In the past, people have heard stories from the male perspective, for example, the Brothers Grimm's numerous fairy tales as well as Homer's Greek epics. Through employing assertive female narrators in her collection of poems, The World's Wife, Duffy reinvents these traditional texts by empowering women and allowing them to define themselves, thus giving them a voice in today's society.
This has been the analysis of Carol Ann Duffy's poems from The World's Wife by Rhiannon and Carrie. Thank you for watching.